Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. Tonight we're talking about morality and moral foundations. Bethany is going to be here pretty soon, and she actually works on some of this stuff. So some of us read an article by Oliver Scott Curry in Behavioral Scientist called What's Wrong with Moral Foundations Theory and How to Get Moral Psychology Right. So I want to start with a question, and the question is, what is morality, and to what extent is it useful to use morality when we're thinking about basic income? And I'll start with Steve.
Well, I'm thinking that morality is just a tool or a system to accomplish another more important project of just fulfilling basic physiological human needs of food and clothing, shelter, medicine, safety, friends and family, the human fundamentals. And morality is just a way that's come up from one place or another to get this done. In particular, I don't think. Well, I'm going to treat morality as not the end in itself, even though a lot of people think that it is the sort of the ultimate height of human behavior and flourishing.
Okay. Any thoughts about basic income?
Well, I think that morality is just a system, and a couple of moral systems that we'll look at are a couple of systems, and UBI is just another system.
Okay. Richard.
Well, in my view, basic income is a means to change people's morality or morals, in that people are more conservative when their resources are scarce, and if they have a basic income, then they are able to expand their views. Like Andrew Yang always says that people who are always like 78%, or I think it is, are people who are living paycheck to paycheck, and what is it, 68%, I think it is, can't handle a $400 or $500 bill. And so if they are able to handle such things with relative ease, then they are able to, well, have a 13 point IQ points, higher intellect, and are able to make better decisions, and are more open to other ideas than they may not otherwise be open to.
Yeah, so that brings up an interesting question, which is, to what extent can people's sense of morality or their moral values be influenced or changed? And I think when you change the world that people are living in, that creates conditions that allow that to happen. Is it on the camera side? Yeah, so before, you can go around that way. Before I give my thoughts on morality, let's hear from Bethany Burum, who's the expert who just got here. So the question is, what is morality, and to what extent is it useful to use morality in the discussion about basic income? Yeah.
So I think that this paper that we read highlights two different ways to classify morality. You can classify it in terms of the kinds of things that people will tend to say are moral, and that's roughly what height does. Or you could classify it in terms of the kind of functional, evolutionarily relevant problems that something is trying to solve, which is more what the authors of the paper's take is.
Right.
And some of those kinds of functions seem to fall under the moral domain, and you could ask why. How useful is it for basic income? Well, I think it's useful in different ways. It could be useful in terms of just understanding what people value and why they want a basic income. Or it could be useful in terms of thinking strategically about what the kinds of reasons that other people are likely to support basic income, or for what kind of reasons other people might be likely to disagree with basic income, and how you could go about working with that. It could help you understand some of the resistance, I think, depending.
Yeah. So just to give some context, Bethany is referring to Jonathan Haidt, and he wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, in which he kind of came up with these 5 categories of morality and argued that, all of our different moral instincts kind of derive from these 5 categories. So I think that way of thinking about it is interesting. It starts to be interesting because it shows you that there can be that morality can pull you in different ways depending on kind of which category you're in. But it's also pretty narrow in that it limits it to 5 categories. And like Bethany said, it doesn't really have any explanation for why we have morality or why we have these categories, that kind of thing. So this article is criticizing Jonathan Haidt, and I think it brings up some good points. And I think the main kind of gist is that morality is a tool, kind of like what Steve said, that helps us cooperate. And I think that's right. And something I like to emphasize about morality is that it's not supposed to be consistent. It doesn't need to be consistent in order to function correctly. It's about our kind of internal feelings, and we have moral intuitions to be able to make snap judgments without thinking about things too hard. And these snap judgments that we make, we developed them because most of the time making the right judgment really quickly will help us cooperate better as a society or as like a culture, right? So when we talk about when you hear the term moral foundations, that kind of calls to mind the idea that you can dig deep and get to some kind of Platonic, unassailable, absolute morality or something like that. And such a thing is impossible because these are moral feelings. If you dig too deep, they don't make any sense. Or it's not that they don't make any sense, but they're not consistent with each other. They contradict each other. So I would say that morality is just a tool. And sometimes, in our discussions, someone makes an argument and I say, oh, well, that's just a moral argument. And then the question is, what is a moral argument and what's not a moral argument? And I would say a moral argument is when you're arguing from an intuition that's kind of that we developed to be able to make snap judgments instead of morality is not for analyzing deeply, like how to make society prosperous or something like that. That's not what it's for. It's a tool that helps us prosper when we're kind of using it unconsciously or automatically. Richard, go ahead.
Well, there's this story about a pharaoh in ancient Egypt that, put these twins in I guess it might be like a cave or something, and then he just fed them, and he wanted to find out what the first language was, and could something like that be used to find out the foundations of morality?
I think it's a really good example because what would happen to those kids is that they wouldn't develop any language at all. And that's what happens to kids who are raised without society. And I think it would be the same. It wouldn't be exactly the same it might be the same for morality. We don't quite know. But a lot of our moral intuitions are at least informed heavily by our society. And so if you raise somebody without a society, I don't know what their morality would look like. The closest we have to that is studying, young babies and children who have developed some cultural learning, but, they're babies or children, so they haven't had as much. And so you can see some of what develops early, which is sort of like a foundation, but at the same time, we also, just as we go through puberty later, the fact that something comes out later or the fact that we're even like sensitive to our culture doesn't mean it's not a foundation. So it kind of depends on what you mean by that question. Yeah. There is some interesting research though on like the morality and ethics of babies and young kids.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question, which aspects of our morality are kind of like biologically hardwired, and which aspects of it are coming more from culture. You know, like we're not born with it and we have to learn it as we learn how to be part of the culture. So I wouldn't say necessarily that one form of morality is kind of more foundational than the other.
Right.
I would actually say that neither one of them is foundational. They're both tools that we evolved to use automatically in order to support cooperation. Yeah.
But you can certainly answer that question in certain ways,
like through the kind of stuff you're talking about.
Yeah, or through like theory too, like we know that like can or through looking for how universal it is. So like favoritism towards your kin or like aversion to incest have clear genetic mechanisms and are universal pretty much to a large extent across cultures. And those are likely genetic. In fact, we can even get beyond that to know like what tells you who your sibling is, you know, and you can sort of trick that mechanism. So if you grow up with someone who's not your sibling, but they're raised kind of like your sibling, even if you know they're not your sibling, you often won't want to date them, that kind of thing. So like incest aversion works in that way, but it seems to be largely genetic and difficult to override, even with cultural practices. So for example, when they would adopt, there was a Chinese marriage system going on for a while in one area of China where they would adopt somebody into the family that was supposed to be the future wife of the son. And the problem was that those marriages had like extremely low fertility. Because incest aversion was triggered because they were raised together, even though they consciously knew that they were not siblings. That's an example of something that's probably not shaped by culture for many reasons. We think it's shaped by genetics.
Did this culture not last very long then?
I mean, they don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was presumably that was part of the reason that the practice died out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
Anyway, so side note.
Yeah, Richard.
Well, what about avuncular marriages where, say, an aunt or an uncle marries, a niece or a nephew to heal a rift between...
Yeah, so that's a great question. So incest aversion beyond siblings or parent-child is not as common or universal. And the genetic costs are also a lot lower. So cousin marriages have been common across a lot of history, and like uncle to like niece is, I guess, is, you know, similarly weaker genetic relationship. So you do see that. And the like genetic consequences are weaker, so presumably that's why the benefits might outweigh the costs in terms of alliances and stuff. And they are often used for like alliances,
and that also brings up the issue of marriage for reasons other than, you know, kind of like our biological instincts tell us, like political marriages, you know, that kind of stuff. You know, like royalty, you know, the princess marries the prince from the other, you know, that kind of thing.
What about the Habsburgs the Habsburg chin and the
hemophilia?
Yeah, hemophilia.
Yeah, like the insulin level.
Yeah, that comes from a lot of kind of intermarrying, intermixing.
Yeah.
Or
But like a good example of the difference between a genetic mechanism and a cultural one is in some cultures, like they think of it as incest to marry certain cousins, but other cousins they're supposed to marry. So like that version of incest with those other cousins is clearly cultural.
Clearly more cultural.
Whereas the sister brother, there's a lot of evidence that it's genetic.
Yeah.
But I'm not even sure if that's what they mean by foundations, like genetic versus cultural. Or
so bringing it back to basic income, can we have a foundational argument for basic income with no morality in it whatsoever?
Well, I wanted to kind of ask you this because in a way you need to have like something that you value or someplace that you start. And so for you often talk about how people might be better off, or more people will be better off if we do X, Y, or Z. And so would you consider that to be a moral argument?
I think that's a good question. And I think Steve was making the point that on some level it is a moral argument.
And I think utilitarians would say it's a moral argument.
Utilitarians might say it's a moral argument. I think you can have something that you want, and you can decide that you want it. And there can be moral things that kind of contribute to why you want it. But I think once you've decided that you want that thing, like I can decide I want humanity to be as prosperous as possible. And regardless of what my internal morality is, we can come up with ways to achieve that or come up with a system for maximizing that that has no kind of morality at that level. And then the question is, am I motivated by morality when I say that I want humans to be as prosperous as possible?
Yes.
You're answering a definitive yes?
I think. I mean, I don't know.
Okay.
How would I mean? Guess you're trying to like say some ways you would define morality or not, but.
So when I think about my life, and I think about, okay, there's this world that I'm experiencing, and my goal is to have, as positive of an experience as possible in this life. So it's about kind of like manipulating the various things that make that happen, that may activate things that I evolved to feel good about, right? Because really it doesn't matter whether humanity exists. That's not important or not. But for me, I want my life to kind of maximize my own utility, right? And I don't think of that necessarily as a moral thing.
But
and
why?
Then,
go
yeah.
ahead. I mean, yeah.
And then when I think about humanity as a whole, human society or that kind of thing, I feel like achieving that, makes, it serves my kind of selfish goal of living the best life possible in the best world possible, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that becomes a moral thing though, because why does it make you particularly happy to live in a world where people are well off? Like that starts to become about preferences that I think would look pretty moral to most people. Well,
imagine that I'm sitting down in front of a computer game, right?
Yeah.
And the computer game has arbitrary rules. But some things, I click on, do interesting things that I want to check out and are more fun and that kind of thing. Is the fact that I kind of want to like do the most fun thing in that computer game, is that moral?
So here's the thing though, like there was that really cool dinosaur robot that like would like scream and cry if you tipped it upside down.
What?
I'm going somewhere with this.
Okay.
And some people found it the most fun to tip it upside down and have it like scream and cry.
Oh, okay.
And in your computer game, like some people might find it the most fun to like ruin everything for everybody. And other people might find it fun to have people prosper. And certainly when we're talking about real people, those preferences are considered, I think, moral preferences. Like how much they get internalized into your own utility, but so does everything. Like that's kind of the unit to which you integrate all sorts of different preferences, including moral preferences.
Okay. So maybe there's a case to be made that even if I don't think of it as something that's moral, there's aspects of that just can't be separated from wanting humanity to prosper.
I guess I don't know why you don't think of it as moral.
I don't. I think of it as kind of like what I want, and I'm not worried about why I want it so much.
So maybe a difference is like usually when people have a moral position, they think that other people should have that moral position as well. And so maybe that's different.
Do I think that other people should have this position? I think that other people do have this position. Like my assumption is that people want everyone to prosper, and that a lot of them want it maybe for more reasons. Maybe that's the reason why they want it. And I think achieving that would kind of benefit most people's utility. It would provide utility for most people if we lived in a world without poverty, that kind of thing.
I mean, I have some counterpoints to that, but I think Richard's had a
go ahead.
Well, I had a thing before this, but to go with what Bethany said about having the dinosaur or whatever tip upside down and cry. Well, there in World of Warcraft, with like your game example, there's a number of years ago, there was apparently this bug where they had I've talked about this before, but they had this like plague or something like that where the people a player caught it and then they like spread it to all these towns and things, and they just so that everyone would die or something.
Right, and there's lots of fighting games and stuff too where people go around killing a lot of people.
Yeah.
Sorry, keep going. Yeah.
And for a way that you can have basic income and not have anything to do with morality, with Sir Thomas More's Utopia, which is like the basis of basic income, you can have the reason to provide a basic income is so that people would comply with the law, so they wouldn't steal or whatever. They wouldn't have anything to do with morality per se, just want them to comply with the law. But then you can also argue that the laws could be reflective of morality.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. What was I going to say?
Well, I feel like what you're saying, it kind of relates to I think why you're thinking of your position as non-moral, because you're thinking of it as like self-interested in a way. And sometimes we think of moral things as different from self-interested things. But I think that once you start to include within self-interest just anything that makes you feel good, then morality is part of that again, because following our morals is something that makes us feel good.
Right, it's internalized.
And so, I think that helps. Maybe what Richard said there helps clarify.
So I would say that I definitely think we should have morality. And I think morality is a good thing. I think it's a useful tool. Now, does the fact that I think we should have morality, the fact that I want humanity to be moral, is that coming from some sense of morality? Or is it just coming from, the fact that I want us to be able to cooperate and prosper? And then maybe that's coming from morality, or like...
Well, I guess I think that some people would describe your values as moral, and maybe this just becomes semantic.
Right.
But most people would describe values that are somewhat, and you're not a strict utilitarian, but are sort of vaguely around well-being and freedom and things. These are things that people consider values that are in the moral domain. So your decisions about whether you think morality is good, whether you think basic income is good, they're coming from a set of values.
Okay.
And I think that those values are generally considered moral values.
So...
And maybe it's not so important whether someone defines them that way or not.
So maybe it's not so important whether I define, whether I specify, or whether we decide that the fact that I want humanity to be as prosperous as possible, whether that's coming from a moral place or not, is maybe not so relevant to, how we talk about achieving that. Is that
right? And I think it's even we kind of understand now what you mean. You have this preference, and then some people might call it moral, and some people might not, and maybe that's not so important.
Right.
We kind of get I think there's not much information lost at this point, and that's what makes it kind of a semantic distinction.
Right. So maybe when I say, pejoratively, I say that's just a moral argument or something like that.
Right.
What I'm saying is that. One, that this, argument is coming from something you want that's not in support of anything else other than the fact that you want it. And maybe I'm implying that the reason you want it is because it's a moral instinct. It's not something you've kind of thought through. And maybe you have a lot of these moral instincts, and of course, because it's morality, it's not consistent. So I'm implying that your argument is maybe not necessarily consistent with what you ultimately want, if what you ultimately want is to maximize human prosperity or something like that. Does that make sense?
Say that last part one more time.
So maybe you're, if you're arguing for something from a moral perspective, but you also have this idea of the ultimate thing you want for humanity, the thing you want the most for humanity, then I'm saying that what your argument is maybe not consistent with, or that you haven't demonstrated that it's consistent with kind of the most important thing to you.
Yeah, so I think you want people to link up why we should do it to some kind of concrete outcome that's important to them, and that way maybe other people can evaluate whether they're on board or not more easily. Whereas if someone just said this is what we should do, then it's harder for other people to evaluate whether they want to be on board unless it's somehow self-evident to them that they agree, because they don't know the consequence that you're tying it to.
Yeah. So if we can think of morality as 5 different instincts that we have that sometimes contradict each other or pull in different directions, or 7 different instincts that we have, or categories of instincts that pull in different directions, or 287, any number of things that kind of pull in different directions. I want to get it down to 1.
But I feel like nobody has it down to 1, and that's impossible.
Well, I feel like it's worth having one thing that you want that, if anything else contradicts that thing, then you would not want that other thing.
But don't you run into the utilitarian problems that have plagued humanity for centuries? Okay, if you really want people to, if you're really maximizing well-being, then do you just kill people and donate their organs to other people? And well, maybe that's bad for fear. But you get into these I feel like it's hard to be a pure anything.
Sure, but you could say I'm a pure utilitarian without necessarily, knowing what the best actions are to support that.
No, but I mean, I don't think very many people really are willing to be pure utilitarians, even in how they think about setting up a society, because we do have these other instincts, like some kind of other sense of personal rights, and we don't necessarily want to violate them, even in cases that would be, I mean, philosophers have come up with like tons of clever examples of this. I don't have them all top of mind, but like there are lots of cases where even if we say we want to set up society for the betterment of people, we're only willing to go so far with that.
We're only willing to go so far for the betterment of people?
Yes. There are certain kinds of things that, even though you could demonstrate they would be better for everybody's overall utility, we're like not willing to do. Or like the story, like those who leave Omelas or something, like with the child who's being tortured, like in order for everyone else to be super happy. And like
scapegoats.
Or like scapegoats. Yeah, like so we have this sense of like individual rights that most people aren't willing to fully give up, at least in our culture, even for utilitarian gain. I mean, we are sort of, but it's like
so you're putting utilitarianism or utility at odds with things that people kind of should want but don't if all they care about is utility.
Well, the argument that philosophers have tried to make is that most people really don't just want utilitarianism.
No, people want all kinds of things, and that's why we have like this kind of conflicting system of morality and these heuristics and these tools, these automatic.
But I would say
instincts.
like you're the same as everybody else in that regard.
I think I'm probably the same as everyone else in that regard. What I'm saying is that if ultimately what I want is to maximize human prosperity, which is what I want, and I can't think of an example that would kind of come into conflict with that, and I would say that torturing a baby. I mean, like, it's like you
infanticide sort of thing.
If people don't want to do it, then that's because doing it hurts their utility too. I mean,
I guess that's
it's
kind of
not
like circular.
I mean,
and you could have a situation where you weren't going to tell anybody about it, so then they wouldn't be sad.
So then nobody else knows about it.
Yeah. I mean, there's better scenarios than that. Human rights and freedom that could technically.
Yeah, I mean.
But I also don't know that this is like that important because again, we're not really debating issues that are pitting like utility, like well-being against like other fundamental values usually in this.
So the reason I care about this with respect to basic income is because people say things like, if you give people money, then they won't work as hard. Right. So then the question is what you really care about how hard people work, right. or do you care about how hard people work because you feel like it serves the prosperity of society or something like that?
Right.
So it's these kinds of things that come up that I want to be able to resolve.
Yeah, and I guess I think sometimes people do care about work for its own sake, and they think it's virtuous in a certain sense ethically. But that itself may come from the fact that that's been a useful moral feeling for them to have.
Right.
Nevertheless, you can't necessarily get past it because it's kind of like what they want and what they value.
Well, you might not be able to get past it for a particular person, but that doesn't mean we can't create a framework for understanding basic income that, thinks about it from another level, right?
Well, I think you'd have to rely on the fact that for the most part, people aren't fundamentally concerned with work for its own sake, or at least it doesn't have to be done in this particular way. Otherwise, I think you can hit...
Have you read Oren Cass?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think otherwise you can hit a kind of roadblock.
Yeah.
I mean, you can try other ways around it, like maybe you think this is good for its own sake, but is it worth the cost of having people do useless work? Is it worth the cost of the environment? So you can either see if they care about something else that's sort of really beyond that, or if they care about that, but there's other costs that they're willing to, that they don't really want to pay.
So maybe a reasonable way of arguing is to call attention to points of conflict between a person's moral instincts that are pulling in different directions.
Say again?
So if a person's moral instincts are pulling in different directions in certain scenarios, then what you do is you bring up that situation to kind of like...
That's a common way to like try to persuade. Yeah. And Michael has some comments on there too.
Yeah, so Michael says a few things. Being better off is just what he wants. That's great. I want you to be better off too, Michael. Yeah. If you can pursue your happiness without holding others to a different standard, maintaining consistency, and without imposing your own will, how can you prove that to be incorrect or a moral argument rather than just a personal preference that you hold without self-contradiction. I'm not sure why it would be important to do so.
To do what?
To try to prove if someone's doing what they want to do and it's not interfering with anyone else, why you'd want to prove that to be incorrect or like just a moral argument or something like that.
Well, I'm not sure. Is that the question, or is the question like generally what we were debating, which is like what's the difference between a preference and a moral argument? I'm not sure. Michael, if you can clarify a little bit, I'm not sure I'm totally following.
Well, I think our morality can influence our preferences. If our morality is just saying, I want to, do this thing that doesn't interfere with anyone else and is this weird, crazy thing that other people wouldn't want to do, I don't know that, I would have any judgment against that.
Right. Well, I think maybe morality is being a kind of preference.
I think the first thing he's saying is that whatever your morality is, it should be universal, or all lives are of equal value. And then he's suggesting a particular one, that everybody can pursue their own happiness without detracting from any other of the equal lives.
Okay, so is it that...
Sort of like Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, I guess?
Everybody pretty much agrees that a moral system should apply equally to all lives.
Right.
Even though, a lot of people agree with that, that might still be arbitrary, but at least we can.
Yeah, I think it's true that part of the reason why morality works is because we're all on the same page about it.
Well, yeah, but we're often not too. It's true that we.
Well, that's when it doesn't work.
It's true that we believe that now for the most part. Although some people, when pushed, certainly people don't feel equally responsible for everyone's lives, which is fine. But also, some people might say that people in their religion or their group, those people's lives are worth more than other people's. Certainly, historically, there used to be moral systems that more explicitly made some people more valuable than other people, like the king versus the other people. But I agree with you that now, at least explicitly, most people wouldn't want to say that they have that kind of morality. Yeah.
But he also mentions, or what could be interpreted as sort of a pure libertarian morality, that the ultimate good is personal freedom, and human prosperity overall is not the ultimate good, is secondary or irrelevant as compared to personal freedom.
Would you say that if everyone's poor and they lack resources to kind of do anything interesting with their time, would you say that that's a form of restriction of freedom?
Well, yeah, it would be you could talk about positive freedoms versus negative freedoms. The libertarians only talk about the negative freedoms, freedom from interference from the government or anybody. But then they're still allowed to say, declare that to be their rock bottom, the goal of their moral system.
Yeah. What's that?
I need to get a snack.
Right now?
Yeah. I can try to get it.
I might have $1.
You like Swedish fish?
There you go, I have $1.
I don't want to.
Yeah. So it's also an interesting question, like when
$1,000.
Yeah.
basic income happening,
For the vending machine, this is might as well be $1,000.
and then it just gets sucked up by the vending machine, never to be seen again.
I'll be right back. Sorry, Alex. I'll be right back.
Yeah. So I think a question we can ask is, when do we care about moral arguments being wrong, or when do we care about an argument not being anything beyond just what someone's moral intuition is telling them? And I think when I care about it the most is when I'm trying to get them to change their mind on something else. If someone just has this, moral framing of something that's not contradicting something or relevant to something that I care about, then I don't worry about it too much. Yeah, Richard.
Well, there's a difference between someone saying that's against my religion and then someone says that's against my religion, so you can't do it either.
Right. Yep, that's true. So right. So Michael's example is, this guy who's doing something that's not interfering with anyone else. Or is he saying that? Well, yeah. For example, instead of being against murder for moral reasons, you could just say that you can't murder without contradicting yourself, which makes holding both positions and being correct impossible. So are you saying that you can't, you don't want to be murdered, so, to say that it's okay for you to murder someone else would be a contradiction? Is that what he's saying?
Well, that's how I read it.
Yeah.
And in any case, the easiest way to get somebody to change their moral thinking is to point out a contradiction or a hypocrisy in their
Right.
own system.
Right. Although I don't necessarily, for me, I'm actually not that bothered by hypocrisy. I often think sometimes it's the most effective thing for, the person could be saying the right thing and saying you should do the right thing, and the fact that they did the wrong thing doesn't necessarily take away from the fact that what they're saying is, correct or something like that,
Yeah, but if they want to make a sort of codify a moral system, it should make a little more sense than,
They should be consistent,
yeah.
with it. It's hard to get people to do as I say, not as I do, that kind of thing. Yeah. Go ahead. Richard.
If people volunteer or whatever to be gladiators or fight duels, is that and murder each other? Does that take away from moral principles? I don't want to murder or whatever.
I don't know. Yeah, I think you can ask all kinds of questions like this.
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of hypocrisies.
Yeah.
Against abortion, for the death penalty, or
For abortion, against the death penalty. Is that also a contradiction? Because it's like, one side points out one contradiction, and then
right,
yeah.
or how about we don't like to kill babies, even if it improves the overall utility.
Yeah.
But we do send a select bunch of soldiers to war to die because it does improve overall utility.
Right. And that's also not something that's been consistent throughout different cultures. There have been plenty of cultures that killed the babies that weren't strong enough, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's an example of something that's, it might. I think it's hardwired to some extent that we don't want to kill babies, but it's not immutable. Yeah. Richard.
Well, there are people who don't want to, or do want people to have abortions, and yet they don't care about the children after they're born. They just let them, do whatever, just rot in a Romanian prison or whatever.
Yeah.
Not a prison, but
Orphanage.
Orphanage, yes.
Yeah. I mean, and then that sounds like if we have the morality of that we care about the outcomes for small children, and we also believe that abortion should be a right, that kind of thing, then we feel like we're pointing out a contradiction, but it might not feel like a contradiction to the other person. So I think a lot of times when we bring up these moral contradictions, especially if we're doing it in front of an audience, if there's people who can observe our argument, then we're not actually trying to persuade the other person. We're trying to show, the people who agree with us, aha, I pointed out this contradiction, but it's really not a contradiction for the person you're arguing with. So I think in order to persuade, you actually have to get the person to think about how their different moral intuitions are actually leading to different conclusions, two different conclusions at the same time.
Yep, Socratic reasoning.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
I do think though that contradictions are sort of a part of that too, because you're often persuasion goes along the lines of you say that you believe in equal rights or something, but then you're not supporting this. You're not you say you believe in equal rights, and you wouldn't want say interracial marriage should still be banned, but you don't believe in same-sex marriage, for example, was an argument that people made and do make. And so that's like pointing out an inconsistency.
Do you think that was persuasive to the people though, or was it just kind of like?
I see this commonly enough that I think it has like some persuasive power, because basically what you're doing is you're saying, like, you're taking something that people are committed to and do want to put forth as one of their moral values, say like equal rights, and you're kind of imposing a cost, or at least a perceived cost, for not adopting your perspective, given that they say that they value that thing.
Because the usual counter argument to that, of course, is kind of the slippery slope thing, where you say like, oh, well, you want equal rights, does that mean, you know, that people should be allowed to marry goats, right?
Or polygamy.
Or you know, like that kind of thing.
I mean, you can always try to push back at it, but I see it used in activism over and over and over again, and I do think it's persuading somebody.
And you think it's used in activism to persuade the people who are activists on the other side? Or do you think it's used in activism to kind of fire up the base, you know, get their supporters to kind of be angry, like moral outrage, that kind of thing?
I think neither. I think it's maybe...
You don't think it's for moral outrage?
Sometimes maybe, but I actually think it's like meant to be persuasive, and I think it's maybe not going to persuade the most extreme people who can never be persuaded anyway, but I think it can persuade people who are on the fence or in the middle, as a little bit. I mean, as much as anything can persuade people.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that particular example, it feels to me like something that's not going to be persuasive.
Really? I totally disagree. I think that this is why. This is part of the power of grounding your argument in a particular kind of principle, is that later people can say, wait, but you said you were doing this for this reason, and it does have some pull, and you do sometimes go in the direction of deciding to be consistent with what you had said before.
So maybe is this how you can persuade people who believe in human rights to believe in animal rights and that kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or like,
I don't know.
Or like, here's an example that Peter Singer uses all the time.
Yeah.
You know, so like if you were walking by a lake and somebody was drowning, you know, would you go in to save them if you were perfectly capable of doing so? Let's say it's a child drowning in the lake.
Yeah.
Well, would you?
Yeah, probably.
Okay, but what if you were wearing a suit that cost like a few $1,000s and it would ruin the suit to go save them?
Are you asking me whether I'd take off the suit first?
No, would you you don't have time. You have to jump in and save them.
Yeah, I'd probably do that.
Right. So then he'll give that whole thing, and then he'll say, and yet, for a few $1,000s, we could save a life of a child overseas by buying, you know, bed nets that would average out to saving that kind of life, or by doing vaccinations, or by doing nutrition that prevents people from dying from diarrhea. And is there a morally relevant difference between the person that's right next to you in the lake and the person that's in the other country? And so you see people like Peter Singer trying to raise effective altruism by exactly this kind of thing. In his TED Talk, it's an example of a 2-year-old who's run over by a truck and nobody helps her for a while, and she dies. And he says, like, I bet you're all horrified. Like, I bet you think you would help, and you probably would. But you could basically, you're doing the same moral equivalent by not helping all these kids overseas. So he doesn't persuade everyone, but he's
obviously
trying.
Obviously, it's not a moral equivalent, because as we talked about, morality is an intuition.
Right,
it's like an instinct.
But it's
not.
A moral argument.
It has nothing to do with morality.
It's a moral argument of the form that I just said, which is like, oh, you want to be like a person who cares about child suffering.
Right.
And like would do something, and yet you're not that kind of person. And in his TED Talk, he's not trying to rile up a base. He's trying to persuade an audience of people into being effective altruists, and he's using exactly that kind of argument.
He's trying to persuade people into being effective. Yeah, you're right. You're right. He's trying to persuade people to be effective with respect to a larger goal. But I don't think he's really pointing out a contradiction in people's morality, is he?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Really?
Because I don't think people can come up with anything easily that maintains the cover story that they value kids' lives enough to pay a few $1,000s.
But he didn't ask them whether they valued kids' lives. He asked them whether they would save a kid in this scenario, which activates all these moral instincts.
Yeah, but the problem is that the reason people, like the value people would want to be seen as having that goes along with saving the kid, it also goes along with helping people in Africa. And so he's kind of got them
So
there.
I think that part's a little bit of a stretch.
I really don't. I think that's exactly why people use these kinds of arguments all the time.
I think
I mean,
obviously
why do
he
you
does
think
use
he
it.
uses this kind of argument?
I think he's using it for that reason. I wonder how effective it is. Is he getting people to change their behavior? To what extent is he getting people to
He
change
gets
their
quite
behavior?
a few people do.
I mean, obviously he's going to get some people, but is it just, by virtue of the fact that, he talks to enough people that some of them start donating more or something like that?
I mean, I don't know. Like, again, I see this over and over again in persuasive attempts, and I mean, obviously it's hard to persuade people because there's a reason they already do what they do.
Yeah.
But I think it's a decently effective tactic, and I can see how the incentives work.
Yeah.
And then there's like the trolley experiment where there's a few people on this track and the train's going towards them, and there's another one where there's one person just there.
Right.
And
yeah,
and then or you can flip the switch and it can flatten the one person or save the three, or you could push a fat person from the train and it would stop it.
I mean, I think all of these things call attention to the fact that our morality is, if you try to examine it too deeply, it's not necessarily even self-consistent.
No,
but that's different from, I think, trying to argue about how our systems should be designed, right?
Yeah, but I think that, like, we're talking about persuading people of things, and
well, we can certainly use morality to persuade. I guess when I was talking about pointing out contradictions, it was less about using morality to persuade, it uses morality to persuade, but in a different way, like pointing out different moralities that are pushing in different directions to show, to ask what people really want. I guess it's similar to the Peter Singer thing, right? Mm-hmm. If people really want to care about children, that kind of thing. I just don't think that's... Part of it is hard for me because I actually don't think convincing people to give more money is actually that useful for human society.
Irrelevant to the point that I'm going to make.
But it just makes it harder for me to
well, the effective altruism people might be trying to get people to give more money. Right. But they're mostly trying to get their morality to be rational.
Right.
Rationally defensible rather than just a big bundle of our intuitions.
Yeah.
And it's in my own case, it's my desire to be rational as compared to my built-in intuitions. Mm-hmm. That is the challenge.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of people would say that that's important, that we should rise above.
Yeah, I mean, I like that. I like the idea of kind of having this rational framework on which to build everything else. So you try to get to that core rational framework of what you want out of society, what kind of arguments you want to make, and then you can hang your morality on that structure. The moral instincts can still just be intuitions and instincts, but when you're deciding what instincts to develop, it can be based on something more rational.
It's really, I largely agree, but it's also really tricky because you have to be really confident that you're developing that based on the right value and that you're not also missing something in attempting to be rational, because there may be a lot going on behind your instincts, and it's like really hard to know whether that's stuff that you want to get behind or not, because it could just be like, oh, well, yeah, I mean, like, I care about the person in front of the lake because I'll get more in trouble if I don't save them, and that's not something I actually want to build my morality on. You could have that kind of case. Right. But you could have an instinct against torturing the baby, and like maybe it doesn't seem rational, and you say, okay, let's torture the baby, but then like it comes out later that like, oh, there was like these unintended consequences that you actually had an intuition for and you couldn't articulate them, and maybe you shouldn't have tortured the baby, and like so it's kind of like difficult because it comes back to that whole thing about how instincts come out of things we don't know the cause, and it can be something we want to get behind or not, like I said.
I think that's the right word. I think it's very difficult to think about these types of things. And that this applies to basic income too, right? It's very difficult for people to think about basic income, especially without kind of going deep into it or figuring out like what we ultimately want and that kind of thing. It's, there's a reason why we have morality, because it's easy. Because it helps us make decisions and cooperate without having to think about it too much, right?
And it's not even just the heuristic value, which you keep emphasizing. It's also that, like, a lot of the reasons are reasons, like, maybe nobody knows what they are. Maybe they're really hard to discern. Maybe they're the kind of things we don't really want other people to know are our motives. So there's a lot of reasons that they're heuristics.
Kinds of things we don't want other people to know are.
Yeah, like maybe ultimately, like what shapes a lot of our moral quirks might be like how easy is it to get caught. But we have another incentive for people to feel that that's not the main thing that's driving our behavior. So we don't necessarily want to be consciously aware of that aspect of our moral intuition.
Oh yeah.
We have an incentive not to be. So it's not just that it's like heuristic. It's like there are other reasons that we're not conscious of every moral motive too. Mostly it's just too complicated to be conscious of motives.
I think it's complicated. I think also these heuristics emerged, in ways that were actually useful. And if you can't get caught, then it's difficult to, have norms emerge or have morality around that necessarily, at least directly, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm saying like a lot of times we have moral distinctions like between actively doing something or causing harm by inaction, or like we avoid information in order to not be culpable for things that if we found out the information we would act differently. So those kinds of things seem to be, we have intuitions that certain things are less wrong, which are the very things that are like harder to get in trouble for. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm just saying that's not a conscious motive for the most
It's not a conscious motive, but it makes sense when you think about how morality evolved.
Yeah.
Because it would only evolve in cases where it's actually effective. Yeah.
But I guess I want to come back to my point about instincts. Sometimes, like it could be costly not to follow them. So I'll give a non-moral example that you know really well, which is like in South and in the Americas, when they had people who had a corn-based diet who were living here indigenously would often say like put ash in the corn or some other thing like that. When you ask them why, they wouldn't really have an explanation for why they did this. So when the Europeans took the corn to the New World, it seemed really irrational to be like putting ash in there, so they didn't. And so then people were getting really sick, and nobody understood why they were getting sick. It took a really long time to figure it out. They thought it was like a new form of leprosy, and they passed all these like corn spoilage laws because they thought maybe it was corn spoilage. But it turned out to be this disease called pellagra, because if you don't do specific things to the corn, you don't get enough vitamin B in your diet if you're living off of corn, vitamin B3, and you get this disease called pellagra, which is really bad and ultimately fatal. And so indigenous populations had developed ways of doing it. But the key here is that nobody actually necessarily consciously even knew this function. So they couldn't even communicate it to somebody else to then go and realize that it was rational to do. So humans tend to over-imitate or to do a lot of things on instinct. And sometimes that's really necessary because nobody even knows why. There could be some function that is really important, say, to a moral instinct, and nobody could articulate or even has the knowledge of why it's really useful.
Yeah.
And so that's a tricky thing. And then the even trickier thing, kind of to Steve's point about wanting to be more rational, is that sometimes that's the case, but sometimes you've got something like bloodletting where it's really not that good, and it survives as a cultural practice in a lot of cultures anyway. Bloodletting is when you let blood out of the body as a way to cure disease. So it's really tough with these instincts, just to give two other examples.
So, I mean,
and moral instincts can be like that too.
That definitely supports the point that this is really hard to talk about. And, no matter how careful we are in analyzing these things, there's no way they were going to figure out that ash thing, right?
They did figure it out.
I mean, they did figure it out. But, well.
We know now.
Yeah. But you don't know what you're missing, right?
It's really hard, It's really hard.
It's hard. I think with something like basic income, with something like economics, there is a little bit of a simpler framework that we can look at. We can look at, the economy produces the same amount, a certain amount of stuff. There are incentives to produce. There's resources that we use, that kind of thing. So we have a little bit of a simpler framework in which to operate. That's not to say that economics is simple, but it might not be as susceptible to some of these things. Mm-hmm. Now, I say that with a caveat that we've been getting, in my opinion, we've been getting a lot of economics wrong with the job stuff and all of that. So it is still easy to get it wrong. But yeah, it's a really hard thing. And I think, this is part of why I try to stay away from moral arguments as much as possible, stay away from moral outrage. And maybe it's true that ultimately the fact that I care about human prosperity has some moral aspects to that. There's no way to know for sure. But but yeah, I really try to keep it as pure as possible. Like, this is the goal we're trying to achieve, and then this is what we can do to support that.
Right. I think that's at least very like transparent. Like I was saying before, so that people can kind of decide if they care about the same thing or not.
Yeah.
Did we go to Michael's last question yet?
Yeah, so Michael says, so can anyone think of an effective argument for UBI for a person that makes the moral argument for jobs needing to be tied to income? Does anyone want to take a crack at this, or should I?
I mean, I'm trying to think of like ways that you could have a UBI and still have largely people getting their income from jobs and like still be better off, but maybe you can take a crack at it.
So what I usually say to someone like that is I ask them, so does that mean you support making up useless work as an excuse to give people money?
Right.
And they're probably not going to say yes. Most people would not say yes to that.
What if they do say yes?
If they do say yes, then I would say, I guess I would ask them why.
Yeah.
Why would you want to take away, people's freedom in this way, and even if it's not contributing anything or producing anything for society, that kind of stuff.
You could say it's like good for the individual.
You could say it's good for the individual. So then the question is, if we're creating jobs because they're good for the individual, would we be creating the kinds of jobs we create today?
Yeah.
Would it have to be tied to income? Is there a problem with sources of income that are outside of that? So I guess it's just about kind of asking where they're coming from. I think a lot of the people who want jobs to be tied to income, they have an intuition that the work is producing something, that they want people to contribute.
Right.
It's not, it's tied to these other things.
Right.
So I think it is a good question to ask the person whether they would support spending resources on forcing people to spend their time doing work that does not contribute anything to society. Usually, when I make this point or when I ask this question, they don't come back at me and say, yes, I actually do think that that's appropriate. They come back at me and say, no, that's not what's actually happening. There is useful work. Here's why the work is useful. Here's why we have so much useful work to do. We can find useful work for people to do and pay them to do it, and that can satisfy what I want. But now we're having a discussion that transitions the discussion not away from people's jobs absolutely need to be tied to income as kind of like the ultimate moral thing that they care about, and into a discussion of, well, wait a minute, to what extent are jobs actually useful? To what extent are we creating jobs to push money to workers? That kind of thing. And then we can, that kind of breaks the moral barrier.
Yeah.
So that would be my suggestion.
I think that, it would be nice to kind of clarify by asking questions how much of it is that they really think it's like moral or virtuous for the individual or something to be like getting their income through a job versus they actually think there's work that needs doing.
Right.
And what that helps clarify the conversation. And then another way you could make sure they really think individuals need to do the work to get the money would be to ask things like, well, what do you think about people who are born into wealth? Do you think that's a problem? Make sure it's not just something about.
I don't usually go with the born into wealth thing because there's always ways to moralize, okay, well, but they did earn it in some way, or their family earned it and they deserve it. Or,
that would still be clarifying for me as to why they think this is important. Because I was assuming their argument might be you really need to go to work every day. That's a virtuous thing. If you're not doing that, and tying that to your income, you're not living the way a man or woman needs to live.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It just feels to me like it's one of the more typical arguments that you see, and people are used to kind of responding to that question, and it feels like more of a dead end.
Well, then it might be more my follow-up question after that'd be important because it takes you down a different avenue. Are they worried about basically people getting money that they don't deserve, or are they worried about the virtuousness of work?
Right.
Those are different things in terms of what you would say next. Because you might say next that do they really deserve it if we're spending resources to give them that job?
Right. Would you pay money to hand someone a useless job because they need that job. They need that job to be handed to them.
Right.
Is our job so important that you would spend resources on that?
Yeah. And the only view I can see is compatible with that is one where it's like good for that individual. They think it's good for that individual.
And I think this kind of calls attention to a lot of people who want people to work for their money. They're also against handouts.
Right.
So if you point out that the job itself is a form of handout, and it's actually a more expensive form of handout than just handing them the money, then that can help too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
And then there's like, what if there are you can give a person a job, or there's more efficient way to do it, or like in a park nearby, from like spring to fall, they have these. They put up pens and then they put goats, and the goats eat like the poison ivy and things like that. Or you can have someone go around and like hack around the poison ivy, hack the poison ivy and sumac or whatever, and they might get it on their skin or whatever. Or you can have someone go out into a field and pick strawberries, and they could get ill from like the pesticides and things.
Yeah, so like it's more costly to make people do work in some of those cases.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, especially in examples where you could get the same outcome, you could get the same product without having to make people work for it.
And I think even if you just get to the point where someone's like, no, like I really want individuals to like go to work, that's important, and their income has to be tied to it, you can at least start to get into like, okay, well, if you know explicitly that you're just like making up work for that reason, what would you want that work to look like? Like,
Right.
you can sort of get into the details of like that, and does it really have to be tied to the income, or do you just want people that have purpose? Or
And then you could ask what counts as work and what doesn't.
yeah,
right?
what counts as
Can
what
we
about
expand
raising
our
your
definition
kids?
of work?
Like,
If you're doing an activity and it's not being paid, can that still count as work? What are how do we help people have the good kinds of work
yeah,
that
it'd
they
be
like?
really
That
interesting
kind
to
of thing.
interrogate such a view, because you'd be like, well, okay, like, does it have to be a certain kind of activity? Could it be that you pay people for anything that they're doing, and would that count as working for your income? Like,
Yeah, and then
as
does
long as
basic
you're
income
making-
count as working
as
for
long
your
as you're
income?
making up work for people, like, does it have to be a certain kind? You know what I mean?
Right,
What they
yeah.
really think is beneficial.
Right.
Which I think would be
Here's an
interesting.
illustration of the intuition that I think is going on. The Pan Mass Challenge. Let's see, us donators pledge money to a person who's going to ride their bike across the state of Massachusetts, basically, in order for our donated money to go to the Jimmy Fund for that cancer.
Right.
So it's the guaranteed jobs or needing to work to get money is like how the Jimmy Fund has to get money. I'm not going to give money to cancer unless some guy rides a bike across the state.
Across the state, yeah.
When I was a kid, I remember I first found out about these things, and I did not understand them at all. I was like,
Yeah.
wait a minute. Why? I like exactly what you're saying. Like, what is going on here? And
It's sort of like the useless
Yeah.
job,
yeah,
but at least it shows that he's morally in the right place. He's just
Right.
doing something useless, and so I'm going to pay him
Right.
or donate.
well, it certainly provides him an incentive to bike further, because if he bikes further, he earns more money. That kind of thing. So that part makes sense. And then maybe you're getting people.
Awareness type thing.
Yeah, it's a whole event built around something. So it's a prompt to donate.
And it like maybe gives you more opportunities to like talk about the fact that you donated and that kind
Right.
of thing, so it makes
Right.
it more visible.
Well, if we see how much he cares,
Right.
then we're more likely to pay him
Mm-hmm.
just because he cares.
Right. So it's
And
like,
maybe a person working at a useless job, at least they are going through the motions in good faith of
Right.
doing some job, even though it's useless, and so we will pay him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I like the analogy. It's interesting.
Yeah, that's a good example.
It'd be nice to, like Bethany was saying, it would be nice to figure out how to have them go through the motions, but have the motions be less crappy than the motions we force people to go through these
Like
days.
with virtual reality or
Yeah.
something.
Well, not just virtual reality, but maybe like doing something fun, like playing a sport. Maybe there's more professional athletes.
Well,
or
I
something
think
like
they
that.
should be bicycling on a big treadmill that stores the energy in a flywheel.
There you
Ah.
go.
Runs all the city buses.
There you go. Yeah.
I like Michael's next point too. He says
Yeah.
he thinks that there might be some deep fear that they might be benefiting at someone else's expense. This is back to our point about people needing to earn a living. Maybe it comes from the same train of thought that government spending is taxi. But yeah, I think that's right. And I think that like some of these lines of questioning that we were talking about would help to get at that, because then if Alex tells them that like, oh, like, so do you want to like expend resources from society to like help them have that job, and that's almost like a handout job, like, so then that would maybe get at whether it's coming from this intuition that you're talking about, Michael, that it's like they're really just sucking resources out from the rest of us. They're not contributing anything directly. Yeah,
sort of zero-sum game. It has to come out on somebody's side.
And I think I like that. You know, I think pointing out that if they have a job, they are benefiting at society's expense. You know, that takes resources.
Right.
You know, handing people jobs is more expensive than handing people money.
I think this is like a huge flip for a lot of people, and probably one of the most difficult things to like convince people of, which is that not every job is net positive contribution, or at least in aggregate, like the jobs are not necessarily all net.
Yeah, I mean, I like to say that the level of employment in the economy has nothing to do with how much labor we need, and everything to do with how many jobs we want people to have.
Yeah.
Right? It's not about, you know, the jobs aren't contributing something. You know, we are providing jobs for people. We're handing people jobs.
You know, like the military-industrial complex creating all these bullets and things that nobody really needs.
So, I mean, there's lots of examples. That's one of them. But yeah, there's a ton.
Did anyone, by the way, this is a total non sequitur, but did anyone point out that Oliver Scott Curry was missing one of the major game theoretic explanations for morality?
We have not pointed that out yet.
Just as a point of education, he for some reason isn't aware of the most commonly discussed one, which is norm enforcement models, which are more like an indirect reciprocity kind of, or like they have sort of higher level rewards and punishments. So the way that those work is like if you don't contribute to something, for example, like you know, let's say if it's like a small scale society, if you don't contribute to like the feast that everyone's supposed to share in, then you become in bad standing. And then other people, for example, don't have to help you when you need help, or sometimes they're allowed to like take your stuff or something like that. And if they, so let's say it's the first one where like they don't have to help you. If they or let's say that you're in good standing and you contributed to the feast, and then someone doesn't help you later, then they become in bad standing themselves. So that's why they're willing to help you later, and so on. So there's different models like this, but anyway, just like maintaining different kinds of social norms is a big part of morality, and there's models for that too. And for some reason, he doesn't talk about them.
Yeah, and I would say that it's not a total non sequitur, because this is that. Expecting people to work for a living is exactly what you're talking about. Expecting people to contribute to the feast. Yeah.
And like then we have a sense that they should be punished if they're not.
Right.
But I think there's something else going on with the working thing too. I think it's that, but I think it's also about what gets individuals ahead in our current society. Whereas like if you internalize a strong work ethic or a strong sense of the importance of work, then you're going to be more attractive to like your employer. And people do require their income from a job. And so I think that like some of it's a spillover from what people want to project about themselves.
And you think wanting other people to work hard is that connected with your own personal desire?
I think in some cases, like especially if it's a really deep value, like work is important, work is virtuous, like work is good. You know, the more you've thought about that for yourself and your life, and not as yourself, but like you instill it in your kids and they do better. You instill it in your collaborators and they do better. You instill it in your employees and they do better. So you're used to like, there's a lot of social incentives to foster and promote this idea.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big part of it too. I think it's both. There's a really funny show, like there's that funny show that I'm watching that has a good example of this, where like they have a dishwasher and the family doesn't want to use it. They're a family from Taiwan, and like their kids are like, why can't we use a dishwasher? It's like, it will make us soft, you know. So that's exactly like these like make work things, but with your own house, which is funny because we usually don't try to do it with our own chores. But the idea is that they're trying to like have their kids be successful members of society, so they want to instill in them a work ethic, even when it's totally useless. So that's kind of like a perfect almost like analogy for like even wanting make work, like even being willing to say like, yeah, we should do work we don't need to do that's useless, that takes up extra time and energy, because we need to like have this work ethic.
But if you don't use the dishwasher after a number of years, it will actually like break down permanently.
I think they were okay with that. They had it disconnected. Yeah, they wanted to wash the dishes by hand for some reason.
Let me illustrate. Going back to the intuitive morals versus rational morals. I've been a vegetarian for about a year. and I still love meat. I just don't eat it. Okay, and I'm not actually really offended by the sight of meat, chopped up animals, and so some people have wondered, am I really a vegetarian? Because I'm sort of just an intellectual vegetarian.
Interesting.
I'm not a viscerally, morally disgusted by meat vegetarian.
That's really
And even I think that disgusted by slaughter is a lot stronger kind of vegetarian than, Steve thought about it and thinks it's not nice to eat meat.
right.
That seems, well, the rational just seems weak.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point because it brings up another point about these instincts, which is that I think people trust your morality more when it's instinctual and emotional and like internalized, because maybe that tends to go along with kind of following it more like intuitively or immediately or consistently or something. Not necessarily like, but I think that's another reason that we have it internalized is like it shows that we really care.
If they think you're thinking through it,
Yeah,
then
exactly.
they might think maybe you're not gonna stick with it. Maybe you're not gonna be consistent or reliable, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's automatic, then you can kind of trust that.
Right.
And this is why, like people like Donald Trump, they can emulate that. They can, or maybe they even feel it, like this kind of like moral outrage, like showing that, like angry about this thing is not okay, blah, 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 blah. People are like, oh, wow. Like, and even though he keeps changing his mind about everything, people still get this intuitive sense
It's like
that he's genuine and he's going to be consistent and reliable and trustworthy.
Right.
In fact, he doesn't even try very hard to be limited by rationality and reasons.
Right.
So he'll give contradictory reasons, if only to prove that he doesn't really care too much about reasons.
Right.
He's a man of conviction and
Exactly.
Emotionally driven.
Yeah. And when it was, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, she was the opposite of that, right? She actually thought about things.
Right.
And that was to her detriment politically.
In some ways,
Yeah.
Right, for some people. Yeah. Did you have something to say too, Richard?
Well, when I was a toddler, I didn't want anything to do with like red meat or whatever.
Oh, really?
Because, and then when it just reinforced it when we went on a field trip to a slaughterhouse in 7th grade, and it was this disgusting.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
Wow, yeah. I helped slaughter a pig once.
Oh, I know. The story is
I won't tell the story.
Don't tell it. It's so bad.
Yeah.
Oh.
So let's get into the article. You guys ready?
Yeah, the article.
Yeah, the article.
And we can kind of think back more to basic income too.
Yeah. So once the exclusive preserve of philosophy and theology, the study of morality has now become a thriving interdisciplinary endeavor encompassing research in evolutionary theory, genetics, biology, animal behavior, psychology, and anthropology. The emerging consensus is that there is nothing mysterious about morality. It is merely a collection of biological and cultural traits that promote cooperation.
I think that's like loosely true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say there's nothing mysterious about the concept of morality. There are certain puzzles,
Yeah.
like why are particular
there are a lot
things
of
moral?
morality,
Yeah, there's a ton of them.
Yeah.
And that's actually a really interesting field that Bethany might be a part of. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It is really interesting. I'm trying to think if they're all basically in the like about cooperation. Vaguely speaking, I'll allow it. Yeah.
And I think it's also interesting because when you talk about philosophy and theology, they're kind of analyzing morality from the inside.
Yeah, exactly.
Like these things are moral. Let's try to construct a framework of consistency based on kind of these ultimate moral truths and try to square them with each other.
Yeah, totally.
Whereas the evolutionary theory, psychology, and anthropology kind of perspective is more like what's up with this morality stuff? Why why do we have it and what does it do and that kind of thing.
And then they're like philosophy and theology might be one of the things that they do really nicely that helps out the other groups is they point out like some of the puzzles. So they point out what our morality looks like. They point out a lot of the puzzles of it. So like the trolley dilemma that I think Richard was talking about really demonstrates the omission versus commission, the action versus inaction. distinction that we have so strongly.
Yeah.
So they do help out the people who are then trying to analyze like why our morality would have those characteristics. And then they also do what Steve was saying, was just like trying to think through like how people might want to have their morality kind of independent of their instincts. So I guess they do both.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
And he mentions biological traits, which makes it seem like they're hardwired by evolution and genetics and so on, and can never be changed.
Yeah, it should say genetic and cultural there too.
It should say genetic and cultural, or it says genetics. It does not say cultural.
Well, it says a collection of biological and cultural traits, but I guess I don't know what kind of distinction he's drawing, because biology and culture are interactive.
At the bottom it says biological and cultural.
Yeah.
Oh, so it kind of covers all the bases between the list up above and the part at the end, right?
Like there's this group of baboons in Africa where there are all the males abuse the females and lesser males or whatever, the beta males I guess they're called, and like 20 years ago I guess it is, they ate this horrible trash and all the alpha males died out, and after that all the females and lesser males, they got along better, and they, even when the new groups came out, outsiders came into the group, they maintained those morals or whatever.
Yeah, the like cultural.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and it kind of speaks to the idea that we can evolve different cultural norms. Different cultures can evolve different norms. Like maybe it's hardwired that we're really good at norm enforcement,
right,
but then what those norms end up being
really
could be completely different things in different cultures.
Like with bonobos and chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are more warlike or whatever, and that they're very closely related to bonobos.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. And you can even go to people, like some cultures are more warlike and less warlike,
Oh, yeah.
even though they're the same species.
I mean, majorly. Yeah, majorly. I mean, like the morality of humans has varied so profoundly across different societies, from thinking that slavery is good to thinking that genocide is good to thinking that, massive genocide is good, like under the like Mongols under Genghis Khan and his descendants.
Yeah.
Like their version of morality is pretty different from our version of morality.
Yeah.
So I guess that's interesting. Like cooperation with whom is also a good question, because like the Mongols, for example, like you were supposed to give the Khan, he's had control over the spoils of war, and he was supposed to be brought like the best women to rape, but like you weren't cooperating with all the civilizations that you were and all the people that you were killing and raping and so on. So there's often different groups that are being cooperated with or against.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's kind of always true. Morality is about cooperating with your in-group. Yeah. So then when you have cultures come into contact with each other, even if they have the same moral values, the outsiders are going to be outsiders, or the other people are going to be other people, right? So so there's the issue of different moral frameworks kind of coming into conflict because they teach different values, that kind of thing, or people have different instincts. And then there's also the question of how do you get along as a larger culture, which is something obviously that we're facing a ton in the real world as we have a global society now.
But what if you came up with a way to maximize human prosperity, but it involved not cooperating?
Not cooperating in what sense?
It was key to your system that the people isolate themselves, in any sense, only compete, don't talk to each other.
I don't know if humans can survive that way.
I'm just wondering if cooperation is not a bedrock necessity of all this.
I would say that it is. I think Bethany has the same.
So some moral systems technically, explicitly, are not about cooperation, or not very much, like Ayn Rand's philosophy.
Right.
But in terms of human societies, some degree of cooperation seems to be necessary for humans, because we're so dependent on culture and learning from our culture. Like we don't know how to make fire genetically, but we're physically evolved to eat cooked food.
Right.
And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of how much we need our culture. So some of that can be cooperation within a family, but I don't know of any human society where there's no cooperation, say, beyond the family.
Yeah, and it's also about
Yeah.
efficient use of resources. Like, we don't have the resources for every individual human to just kind of be surviving on their own. Even if they somehow, if you gave them like a tablet that, or some kind of little machine that taught them everything they needed to know to survive, you wouldn't have nearly enough resources to support everyone kind of being
Well,
self-sufficient.
I guess I'm suggesting the science fiction scenario that you came up with
Yeah.
a system that raised human prosperity as long as the humans don't talk to each other. But I guess you can just say, well, the humans need food, the humans need clothing and shelter, and they also need a family and a social life, just to survive and thrive.
Well,
You
I
can
guess,
just throw that
yeah,
into
I mean,
the
I think,
needs.
I think
Yeah.
it's a psychological need. I also think though, like now maybe on the foundation of so much human cooperation that brought us to this level of technology, you might be able to create a situation like that. But with the tools that small scale societies had in the beginning, you couldn't really survive like that. Yeah, for sure.
There's this episode of Kino's Journey, which is an anime and a novel, where country creates a telepathy generating device, and so everyone who was exposed to it is able to read each other's minds. So, and these people separate themselves just to the distance where they can't read each other's minds anymore, and they have robots do all the work for them. And so, the main character visits the country, and everyone's surprised they can't read her mind, or she can't read their mind.
Interesting. Huh. That's cool.
Too much social contact.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Could be there.
Yeah, I mean, there's the question of how do you provide humans with basic subsistence, and could you do that if everyone's alone? And I think Bethany is saying probably not.
Well, I guess it's different
Yeah.
if you assume that like we can use a bunch of technology and kind of like superordinate cooperation that we don't have to participate in all that directly.
Right, like if everyone has
Yeah.
a virtual reality where they feel like they're cooperating with other humans, but there aren't
Or,
actually other
I mean,
humans
so there's
there.
two components. There's like survival baseline and there's like psychological needs. So I was saying
Right.
like humans haven't ever had a society so far where they weren't somewhat interdependent. But now that we have so much technology, like eventually you could imagine a future where we had already used human cooperation to develop like replicators and some kind of self-sustaining robot society. That would have required a ton of human cooperation.
Right.
But then people could go off in their corners with replicators, perhaps.
And that all the
Yeah.
cultural learning you need is able to be provided to you without actually having to interact with a human.
Yeah, exactly, like in a
Yeah.
computer or something. Now,
Right.
psychologically, because we evolved under conditions of social needs, like I think that would still be bad unless they had like really good virtual reality or something like that.
Yeah. So there's that. So there's providing, like a basic subsistence thing, and you can kind of come up with a hypothetical way to make that work. And then there's Steve's original question, which is there a way to maximize human prosperity while you're doing that? And I think the answer is an unequivocal no.
Okay.
That, we gain a lot through cooperation, and through, like markets and trade and,
Right.
like being able to pool our resources and specialize and
Really.
communicate. Yeah.
Yeah. Very much so. But it's
Yeah.
interesting that we can like be more quote unquote independent now because of the form and level of sophistication of cooperation and division of labor in the society.
Yes.
Like
that
we
is
could go and live by ourselves in an apartment and feel independent in the sense that we use money for things and stuff like this,
Right.
even though we're still very much part of like an interdependent, highly cooperative system
Yes.
and contributing to it.
There's actually this there's this game show in the late '90s where where this guy he entered all these sweepstakes, and all he could eat was food he got from sweepstakes, and so they're like delivering him like dog food and stuff, and so he had to eat the dog food.
Wait, what was this? This is a movie?
No, it's a Japanese sweepstakes game show type thing in like in the late '90s or something like that. And so he was eating dog food because that's all his sweepstakes were delivered to him, and so then he was able to eat like Tang or whatever because they delivered that, and then they delivered him a television, but he didn't have the cord for the television, so he wasn't able. So it's a bunch of weird things.
That is a weird one, yeah. Huh. Oh, and Sultan's here. Hi, Sultan.
Hi, Sultan. Michael's pointing out that there might be a big difference in the level of scarcity for the environments between bonobos and
Yeah, that's a
chimpanzees.
good question.
So it'd be interesting to like swap their environments and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
My guess is it would not go well.
The genes.
Well, each
they
one is
wouldn't go well
adapted
'cause
to
they're
their own
not
environment.
adapted.
Yeah.
But also, like, I think a lot of their behavior is probably genetically coded, with some exceptions, like what Richard was saying.
Yeah.
And so probably they stay relatively the same in terms of their level of cooperativeness.
Yeah, but it would be interesting to see how quickly the genetics might change too.
Yeah,
Adapt to the
it could. I
environment.
mean, it
Yeah.
could change if it didn't just die out.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a way to know how much of it is genetically coded and how much of it is
Well, it's like,
cultural.
I mean, most animals don't have this very much anything close to the same level of like cultural
Because they
differentiation
don't have
that humans
the
have.
language that we have.
For many reasons, yeah,
Yeah.
language being a big part of it, and so like, I mean, part of the clue is that you don't see a lot of variation among groups versus you do. Part of the clue is to see if they pass different cultural innovations on to each other. Part of the clue is like, yeah, like some of the things Richard said show that like it can happen. So you could try to introduce like a new thing and see if they shift. But if everyone if there's pretty consistent behaviors across all members, then I guess maybe it's cultural in the sense that they have to learn it from each other, but so far as I know, most species know most of what they need to survive. And like, it's not a specific thing that like a subgroup of them have figured out one way and a subgroup has figured out another way, like with humans. I don't know.
Do you think most of them are born knowing how to survive? Or is that a separate thing?
I mean, I think the way I think of culture is not that you just have to learn things from each other. That's one aspect, I guess, but I think of it as like innovations come along and get maintained in the group that were never part of the genetic coding in the first place. And so like tool use can happen among apes, but so far as I know, it's rarely learned from the others and passed on.
So they have to keep it that
way. Whereas humans are nuts this way. Like I said,
Totally nuts.
so like the way to survive in the Arctic is totally different than the way to survive somewhere in Africa.
Yeah.
And like those are cultural innovations. Those groups over cumulative generations figured it out, but it's not a genetic thing where you could take one and put them in the other and they would somehow have the knowledge.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I think about culture.
Yeah.
Well, there's this family in England where they're not able to speak in particularly well because they have this gene. They lack this gene, the VOX3, I think it's called, and so they're not able to cooperate, and they think that they might have like inherited or something like that from like the Neanderthals, and the Neanderthals weren't able to like interchange their like technology and things like that as well as humans,
Right.
and so that might be part of it. And how you were saying about cultural memes or whatever being interchanged, there was this episode of This American Life where this camp in the late 90s where they had these like the groups and they were talking about how these this guy started like this thing back in a decade before and they're still using it.
I think I might have heard this episode, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In this American Life, you said? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's really interesting, like how those things get passed on.
Mm-hmm.
The humans are so attuned to cultural learning and over copying, like I was saying before, and everything else. It's such a bizarrely uniquely human thing that we're cultural in that way.
Yeah.
It's not that there's no futures of culture, but you don't seem to get cumulative cultural evolution in other species, where innovations build on each other.
Yeah.
Which is how you get such craziness in humans. But it's also what we acquire, it's what we're addicted to, kind of, or need as a species. So that's kind of to your point, Steve. Like, it's not just a luxury thing, or just a thing post-agriculture.
Yeah. You guys ready for another quote?
Yeah.
So the main theoretical problem is that moral foundation theory's list of foundations is not based on any particular theory of cooperation or any explicit theory at all. Indeed, Jonathan Haidt, has explicitly argued against taking what he calls an a priori principled approach to moral psychology, and instead has advocated taking an ad hoc approach. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Did you want to say something first?
No, go ahead.
Well, I guess I sort of said at the beginning that there's different ways you could go about thinking about morality. And one way is kind of what are the kinds of things that we explicitly would think about as moral things or like class as moral things. And the other has to do with more like evolved functions. and trying to be coherent about like what things have to do with cooperation or something like that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with Height's way, which is sort of the former way of saying like what are the kinds of things that people will say are moral, and what are those like, or what are those about?
And just kind of cataloging
Yeah,
that.
just kind of cataloging that. And I think even those two things can be combined in an interesting way, because if they don't line up, like that's also kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Like why are these things classed together as moral explicitly if they're not about one kind of function, or that kind of thing. So I think I don't think there's anything wrong with it.
Yeah, I mean, it occurs to me that Haidt is like a taxonomist.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
So he's coming up with a taxonomy
Right.
of morality by observing what's out there in the world.
Totally, yeah.
And
Great-
then
great analogy, yeah.
and then maybe people like you or people like
We're like the Darwins. We just come in, we
Yeah.
explain it all.
right. So then Oliver Scott
Yeah,
Curry is
right.
maybe thinking of himself from the more
Yeah, exactly.
Darwinistic
Right.
perspective.
But
But they're
yeah.
both useful.
super, and the
Yeah.
taxonomists were a big part of what paved the way for Darwin. There were people cataloging things like in these very careful ways,
Yeah.
and that's a lot of the evidence that he drew on to like argue his theory of natural selection.
Yeah.
Had to do with how like family trees among the animal species and plant species worked.
Yep.
Which required that taxonomy. So, yeah, I think that's pretty important.
Yeah, and then having a framework for understanding why these things evolve can help you solve aspects of the taxonomy that are puzzling, that you can't just understand based on doing more taxonomy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that's right.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really cool to be thinking of, why we have morality and what it's for. And I think that helps us better understand when to use it, and maybe when to look beyond it, when to look at something more rational, or when to focus on starting with the rational and then using that to shape our morality, like what Steve was talking about.
Right.
Yeah. Ready for another one?
Yeah, let's do it.
Do.
This is, oh wait,
I think
Isn't this
this
what we
might be
just
the
did?
same one.
Yeah. I don't think we did this one yet,
Oh.
but we don't
Oh, right.
really have time
I
for
see.
all of them.
So, despite claiming to be an evolutionary cooperative account of morality, moral foundation theory fails to include the four most well-established types of evolved cooperation:
Where's norm enforcement?
kin,
What the
altruism, reciprocal altruism, and competitive altruism, and respect for prior possession.
Moshe was pretty scathing about Oliver Curry. I sent you his response.
Yeah. So,
he's like he only knows game theory from like reading The Selfish Gene, and like only knows the models that are in there, and that book is like kind of outdated.
yeah.
I don't know if that's true, but I don't have a problem with Oliver Curry, but he is missing
Yeah.
the most one of the most important ones. So it is pretty weird that he's missing that one, and it does make you kind of doubt his knowledge of the field.
Right, and it's interesting because
Yeah.
at the top, the Jonathan Haidt quote that he quotes actually explicitly lists norms as one of the things.
Yeah.
But he doesn't get into it.
Norms
here.
are like really key, and he just doesn't have it in there.
Yeah.
And it's weird. And he has weirder ones, which are fine, but like more like less major,
Yeah.
like
So
competitive altruism and stuff is.
So I think it's weird for Jonathan Haidt's moral foundation theory to claim to be an evolutionary cooperative account
Oh yeah,
of
I
morality.
agree. That is.
I think
true.
that's right. I also think it's true. Bethany's criticism is valid that Oliver Curry doesn't necessarily have a broad enough framework to capture all the interesting things that are potentially there about morality.
I mean, I agree with all the other ones that he has there, but he's just missing a really important one.
Yeah, and at the end, he kind of comes up with like 5 or 7 categories of morality, that kind of thing.
He also links some of them to specific game theory models, and others he doesn't really explain, like respect for prior possession, which could be linked to like Hochdove, but he doesn't link it to that directly.
Right.
And he also talks about Hochdove later, but not in most lists. So
yeah, so I think there's like as Bethany well knows, there's a vast teeming array of opportunities for using game theory to develop understanding for different moral situations, moral differences in different cultures, and even using morality to help inform more different kinds of game theory models and that kind of stuff. It's a
exactly.
vast, unexplored,
Totally.
largely unexplored territory that
Yeah.
we're kind of scratching the surface of.
Can I ask
Yeah.
a question about game theory then?
Yeah.
Heights and Curry's are model systems are referring to things that worked a million years ago in a village. And so, other than being hardwired in humans and hard to change, they might be completely irrelevant.
Yeah,
We
that's
have
a
to
great
wonder,
question.
it's completely
That's a great
irrelevant
question.
to modern times.
So, to that question, you have to decide what you think is relevant in terms of shaping contemporary morality. So, so some people would rest primarily on genetic evolution, but other people talk also about learning systems that have their own kinds of payoffs. So, if you are copying successful people in your environment, that can accumulate over the generations towards somewhat functional behavior. Or if you're getting kind of reinforced with reinforcement learning in one direction or another.
Right.
So the way that I do this work, I also try to understand like cultural differences in morality and the incentives that shape those, or contemporary morality and the incentives that shapes that. So I'm not kind of limiting myself to just the
that's what I was
genetic
wondering.
process.
If game theory can apply to modern times
Right.
just as well,
Yeah.
and help get a modern answer.
I believe that, and many people do. So here's an example, somewhat outside of morality. So he talks about costly signaling for morality, but costly signaling can explain really well, I think, the use of like luxury goods, and it can also explain cultural differences in whether we like people to have tan skin or untanned skin, or be heavier or lighter, depending on what's a better signal of wealth. And those are all things that we have to figure out non-genetically because they're different depending on the contemporary circumstances. But the costly signaling model, I think, still explains it quite well. So that's just one example of using game theory in a more contemporary context. But there's lots of them, and most of what I do would use it in that way. Sometimes I think it's a genetically coded thing, but for most of our morality, for example, we know that it's not like we have one clear moral instinct that we just are born with and then that's it. So it's not so useful for that, I think. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not everybody thinks that way, but most people, I think most people do, in terms of trying to apply it to morality. But there's variation on how much people focus on the kind of what they call the environment of evolutionary adaptation, like the village back then, and how much they think things are kind of just like spilling over from that to now versus they're getting updated now with incentives now.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a very good intellectual debate question there.
I like to say when I'm bragging about the stuff that Bethany does, I like to say that evolution is evolution, whether it's biological or not. It's the same game theory. It's essentially the same
Right.
processes. It's a learning process, an iterative learning process.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we talk about like for game theory to be justified, you just need a process whereby more successful strategies become more frequent. And that could be a genetic process, a cultural learning process. It can be a conscious process. Obviously, we don't think through much game theory in our day-to-day life, so I don't focus on that one as much, but it can be any of these things, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, people who the Spanish people actually have a list because of a king from centuries ago, and while the people who settled like Colombia and
right.
things don't have a list because that was before they were settled before the king who had a list.
That's really funny. So they were all copying the king in terms of copying successful people. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great example.
That is really interesting.
That's funny.
I never knew why that was.
Yeah, I didn't know.
Okay, so we're getting to the end. I'll do one more quote.
Pick a good one.
Pick the last one.
Ooh.
Equipped with this new map of the moral landscape, we can now examine familiar ground in greater detail and survey previously unexplored territory. We can take a fresh look at the genetic basis and the psychological architecture of morality. We can reassess the relationship between morals and politics, and we can investigate why moral values vary around the world. Above all, by using a theory to generate new testable predictions, we can pave the way for a genuine science of morality. Yeah. So I think that sounds great, and I like the idea of reassessing the relationship between morals and politics. And I think, in order to expedite the process of getting something like a basic income implemented, it's going to take some of that. Yeah, and really, you know, when we're deciding on our policies, you know, thinking about them at this higher level, you know, what are we ultimately trying to achieve? And even if some of that is informed by morality, not just leaving it as, you know, these are our moral instincts and we want to push them through the policy and make them happen.
Right.
I think would be a lot more effective. You know, it's hard to use morality to decide what our morality should be.
Yeah. But it's also hard to decide what our morality should be without morality. I mean, you have to start somewhere, right?
Well, if we start with something more rational or some goal that we're trying to achieve, then we can use that to influence our morality. We can shape our morality around what we ultimately want, or to the degree that's possible. I think it's useful to try to do that. Yeah. Like if more concretely, if my goal is to maximize human prosperity, then I want my moral instincts to serve that goal. So I try to shape my morality in service of that. Yeah.
Like Star Trek?
I don't know.
Like they de-emphasize money and they emphasize human prosperity and progress and exploration and things.
Do they consciously make a decision that's kind of like the goal, and then they try to orient people's morality around that goal?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I guess I've just been like unsuccessful in what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because I've never been able to pick a principle that I was willing to like pursue at the expense of everything else. Because there's always these like cases really quickly that like I'm like, no, I don't want to like kill people and give the organs to other people, but I can't really like decide why. So I guess I don't really have like a consistent utilitarian principle, even though I care quite a bit about like social welfare, at least in the abstract. This is even let alone my own personal actions, which don't align well with any of this, like most people's. So like, I don't know but I guess like I haven't been able to pick like one value. I've just had to like live with the fact that I have like somewhat inconsistent things that I want.
Well, I think that's true of me too. And you know, it's not just that I have one value in terms of like my day-to-day decisions, but in terms of thinking how to design our systems, how to design the society. You know, like it's a little bit easier to think about at that level. You know, like what do we want people's incentives to be? What do we want to?
Yeah, I think it's easier, but
yeah.
I think I still run into like these personal rights, freedom, utilitarian like trade-off issues, or I can't really say like everything is in service of like one or the other, and I'm not sure that is needed either.
Okay.
But certainly I don't think that I've been able to do that in terms of my personal philosophy of society.
You don't think you've been able to do it at all, or you don't think you've been able to do it maybe to the level that you feel like I'm talking about?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by at all. It seems like kind of an all or nothing thing. Like you're saying, like everything should, like all your morality should serve this one.
No, I'm saying, you know, influence your own morality to serve the goals that you.
Oh yeah, I mean, I can
want.
do that to some degree, but it's just not going to be very like perfectly consistent.
I don't think everyone's going to be perfect at this either, right?
I'm not even sure that we should be shooting for that, because I can't even get on board with it, like morally or emotionally, that like I should be like totally sacrificing like rights or freedom if they conflict with human well-being. Like sort of I can get on board with that, but then if you come up with like specific cases, I'm like, no, I'm definitely not on board with that.
But I mean, I don't even think about that, like sacrificing rights or freedom. I just think, you know, maximizing rights and freedom is part of maximizing human well-being. And that's both
like,
the positive freedoms and the negative freedoms.
You can kind of come up with like clever counterexamples and stuff, and then, you know.
Yeah.
I think it's like less, it's like, yeah, I don't know, it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I think once you start getting into like individual details and trying to make calculations about things, or even, then it gets harder once you get into the nitty gritty.
Right.
But
or
that
like
doesn't mean
thought experiments and stuff.
Right, because philosophy is by and large trying to make morality, you know, internally consistent, which it's not. I'm not going to.
That's what I'm saying, though.
Yeah, I'm not advocating that we do that. that we try to make morality internally consistent.
No, but you're saying everything. Yeah, you kind of are, because you're saying like if everything is in favor of human well-being, that's like utilitarianism.
Right. So I'm not saying we should make morality internally consistent necessarily. I'm saying that we should want to shape our morality so that it's consistent with kind of what we ultimately want. That's outside of the moral framework.
No, this is no, it's the same thing. You're just calling it utilitarianism outside of the moral framework, but you're just saying that everything is serving that, which I'm saying.
Well, so here's an example. You could have moral intuitions that are contradictory with each other, but together, the fact that you have both of these intuitions, that you're following those moral instincts, they serve the greater purpose. Like, this is true of morality in general, right? Like, we evolved to have morality, and it's internally inconsistent, yet when it's all taken together and people are making moral decisions most of the time, it serves the greater goal of human cooperation, right? Like, that's true.
Not entirely. I mean, it serves like a complex mix. It serves like vaguely but imperfectly serves individual incentives, which can also align with cooperation. Or like fitness incentives. It's like way more complicated than what you just said. And I would not agree with what you just said. Because like we have a lot of like plausible deniability like effects on morality that are not good for human prosperity, but are like driven by the fact that it needs to be individually incentivized in a lot of cases. So morality is very limited in terms of its promotion of social welfare by the individual incentives involved.
Are you arguing that there are certain things morality can't do and it therefore doesn't do them? Or are you arguing that we've somehow evolved to have moral systems that make us worse off, like collectively, than otherwise?
Yes, that one.
The second one?
Well, worse off collectively than what? Than like if
Than not having those moral systems in place.
Oh, then not having them? Well, and what? And having other ones? I'm saying like, okay, if most of morality was driven by group selection instead of individual selection dominating group selection, you would get more efficient, more socially efficient morals, for example.
I think that's true.
So they're not like optimizing social efficiency, that's what I'm saying.
Right, but that's because they can't. Because you can't have group incentives that are incompatible with individual incentives and get that outcome, right?
Yeah, but now I thought you were talking about trying to set up society so that it was benefiting, like so it was like it was promoting social welfare.
So first we
should probably take this offline.
First we were talking about reshaping our morality to support an ultimate goal, and that could be a group goal. And then I was just bringing up the example that historically our morality, even though it's contradictory, together it all works together to serve a purpose. Like, that's all I was saying. I wasn't saying that it promotes the group over the individual. Yeah.
Right. I'm gonna stop talking about this, but I'm not sure I really agree with you. Anyway.
Well, let's
we should let other people
let's get some final thoughts
Richard
on basic income and morality.
Sorry, we went off on a bit of a
So go ahead, Richard.
There's this episode of Star Trek where these people are, creatures or whatever from a distant galaxy like Andromeda are trying to infiltrate the Milky Way with and so they're like centipede creatures initially, and so they transfer their minds over to a humanoid structure body, and then over the 300 years they keep they're less and less like the centipede creatures they were initially, and so they eventually make it here, and how do I say it? They take over the Enterprise in the original series, and they want to, then they start going back, and then to the Andromeda, and Kirk and the others convince them that there's no reason for them to go back, and that they can just send back a probe, and they can live on. The Federation will give them a planet or territories or whatever to live on instead of conquering them, and so norms can change, but over generations, over space travel. Because we don't really have, even with like a warp drive or whatever, it would take 300 years to get to Andromeda or whatever.
Okay. So it's basically just an example of them adapting to their environment and their norms changing, and then maybe they're not even the same culture anymore, so they can't go back. That kind of thing. Okay.
That was in the Kirk and Spock, the original series? Okay. I thought I had encyclopedic knowledge of the original series. Okay.
Steve.
A lesser example of morality changing, see often cited, is gay marriage. In, I guess, just 10 years, went from abhorrent to a very large majority of Americans to basically okay with most Americans. And I understand that how they did that is sort of door to door, person to person. So it can be done.
Yeah. Well, I've spoken a lot.
You've spoken a lot.
But I do think it's interesting to think about what kinds of discussions to have with people about basic income and how it relates to the moral values that they have. The way they think about morality.
Yeah. So Michael says, can environment affect evolutionary change? If so, are humans consciously influencing or choosing their own direction of evolutionary change with tech or social systems like the economy? Yes.
I would say
all of the
correct.
above.
I mean, genetic evolution would take a while, but cultural evolution and other kinds of evolution take less time. So that's happening all the time, I think.
Yep. And Sultan says there are some papers that say we might not have consciousness. Wow. I don't even know what that means. That's interesting.
She might mean like free will or something.
The thing that we have.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I'd be curious to see what those are.
Yeah.
Free will.
So, I mean, I think this is a great discussion, and I'm heartened by the fact that like our morality can change so quickly surrounding political issues and that kind of thing, and I think we can do that with basic income, and I think it is a challenge to get people to feel differently about people have to earn a living, work for a living, that kind of thing, but I think the biggest challenge facing basic income is still on the economic theory side, and that it's going to be hard to shift people's moral thinking about it without having something to show them, to say, hey, this is actually going to be better for everyone, and it's better in a lot of the ways that you want things to be better too, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We have to have that kind of foundation, and it's not really a moral foundation. It's just a foundation of explaining how the economy works.
Yeah, there's just evidence that you persuade better by framing things to people in terms of people's other values, their values.
Yeah.
I think an economic crash would go a long way to changing people's ideas of economics.
Yep.
Like what we almost had in 2007.
Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thanks guys. So next week we're back on Wednesday,
Yep.
And we're getting more into some economic stuff. We're talking about Say's law. So Jean-Baptiste Say was a 19th century French economist, and Say's law is kind of paraphrased as supply creates its own demand. So this is one of the foundational things of supply side economics. So we're going to be getting into that next week.
And how it relates to basic income.
How it relates to basic income. Thanks guys.
Bye everyone. Cool. Was I still on the? Yeah, I was still on the camera. I moved away from you.
Say's law. So Jean-Baptiste